Today, we're going to talk about the difference between statutes and regulations. Most importantly, we're going to learn how to tell the difference between the two of them, especially when you see a citation to one that you're not quite sure what the citation means. We're also going to talk about the process that gives us regulations and that gives us statutes. And we're going to talk about the nature of the resources that come along with that. The first thing that is important to know is that each action that either the legislature or an administrative agency takes comes with its own paper trail. And this paper trail, we can see in the library, they all look different. They all have different forms that they take, and they represent a different process that builds them. And each of these has a different kind of citation format that we've used the Blue Book to decipher. Why are we talking about the paper trail? Well, that's easy. Everything that you find on Westlaw or Lexis is actually born on paper. And these are just digital versions of the original paper form that we look at when we research something on Lexis or Westlaw. So, to understand what we're dealing with on Lexis and Westlaw, we need to understand what it was born as and what role it plays in the entire process. So, let's think for a moment about the legislative branch. States have legislatures, and the federal level has a legislative branch as well. This is Congress, divided into its two houses, and it will enact a law. Either the president will sign it or Congress will override a veto, and the law will come out as a session law. And the first phase of this statute's lifespan is printed as a session law. It can be as little as one page or more likely a pretty large packet. Each session law in a session of Congress will eventually end up in a bound book called Statutes at Large. Now, the session law is cited in one way in the Blue Book, and the Statutes at Large citation is cited in another way. And if you see this, you may wonder, before you've looked into it, what does this actually mean? If I just see stat period written in a citation, I may not know that it stands for statutes at large. So first we're going to explore what all of these resources are, and then we're going to see towards the end how you actually cite them in the Blue Book. But as far as the process goes, we have the session law that comes out. Then it will be bound eventually into statutes at large. Through this whole process as well, you have these statutes codified, which means they're organized into a whole bunch of books that are organized by topic. Or in our case, it's organized by title in the United States Code. Now, the United States Code comes in an official printed version. They print it every 6 years. We're due for another one in 2024. But the amount of shelf space that this thing takes up is, it's not insignificant. It takes up a good bit of shelf space. And this is the most basic collection of United States statutes. There are also annotated versions of these, which means that some very smart people were paid by West or Lexis to take notes on each of these statutes, show where other resources have referenced them, and show the legislative history behind it, and show as well, most importantly, a list of decisions where these statutes have been argued over by higher courts. These are the notes of decisions, notes to decisions. This is the entire framework for the way Westlaw and Lexis is organized. So whenever you're interacting with a statute that you see on Westlaw, for example, all of these tabs represent some feature that is in their proprietary annotated code. As you can see, there is a lot more shelf space that gets taken up by the annotated code than gets taken up by the official code. And why is that? because there are tons and tons of notes in them. Just like there's a federal legislative process, each state has its own legislative process as well. In Massachusetts, the equivalent to statutes at large is Acts and Resolves of Massachusetts. This is the compilation of every single act legislated by the state legislature. Just like the acts of Congress, how they are codified into the United States Code, Massachusetts also has its own compilation of its laws, organized into what's called General Laws of Massachusetts. Much like the United States Code, the official version takes up a lot less space than the annotated version. Here we have both the West version of the Massachusetts Annotated Code, and we also have the Lexis version. They take up a good bit more space on the shelf than the official code. And again, all of the statutory resources that you're going to access on Westlaw or Lexis are based on the print version of these. So we've just talked about what statutes are, where they come from, and what kind of paper trail they leave behind. But what about regulations? Regulations are what we refer to when we're talking about administrative law and the process by which an administrative agency can make rules for people to follow. When we talk about regulations, rules, administrative law, all of this falls into that. So it's important not to mix up a regulation with a statute, not to refer to it as what it isn't. So basically, all regulations are issued by executive branch agencies, and they follow some sort of procedural code to make them, whether it's the Federal Administrative Procedure Act or a state equivalent. The first step in the administrative process when an agency wants to make a rule is it has to announce it. In the federal government, the way that an agency announces its rules is through the Federal Register. Each day, a new Federal Register issue comes out. There's an immense amount of content in these. Each year, there are tens of thousands, perhaps even up to 100,000 pages in each volume of the Federal Register. It's a lot of information, but inside it, you can see the entire rulemaking process at work. The citations for Federal Register entries will come up, and they are found in Blue Book Rule 14. We'll go over that in a little bit. But the important thing to know is that just like the first step of the statute's lifespan once it is enacted, just like a statute ends up in a session law and it ends up in statutes at large, any kind of regulations will always make their first appearance in the Federal Register. After the Federal Register, just like a statute gets codified into the United States Code, a regulation will get codified into the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. These are updated in print every year, and anytime a federal agency makes a new regulation, it tends to state which regulation it is amending or where it may go in the regulatory code. And just as every state has its own statutory resources that match up more or less with the federal session laws and statutes at large and statutory code, each state also has its own equivalent to an administrative register and to a code of regulations. In Massachusetts, we have the Code of Massachusetts Regulations. Each state has its own name. They're all going to have either administrative or regulation or rules in the title of them, but if you want to find the specific title, then you'll go to T1 in the Blue Book, which we'll cover in a little bit. Now that we know the process and the paper trail that gets left behind in making regulations, let's have a look at how you'd actually access these on Lexis and then on Westlaw. From Lexis's landing page, you can see the various content types there. Under Administrative Codes, you can access administrative regulations and rules. In addition to browsing by any state or federal jurisdiction, you can also view the registers and the administrative codes of any jurisdiction. For here, let's go into the Massachusetts Code of Regulations. You'll notice, first of all, that once we get into the Code of Massachusetts Regulations, there are a lot of titles in it, and we could read every individual title to find out how it's organized. Or, if there were an index, we could look in the index. Instead, we just need to type in what we're looking for in the search bar. So if we want to know about pipe fitting licensure, we can find out the exact spot, which is Title 528 in the Code of Massachusetts Regulations, that the pipe fitting regulations for licensure are. So we can go into it and we can look around and we can see the section in the regulatory code about that. But we notice that it doesn't explicitly mention right there how I might find further information on it. So, as all federal regulations will be, all state regulations are also announced in the state register. So we can go back to the registers and we can view the Massachusetts register and we can look perhaps to see where these regulations came from. And again, there's no index, so we just type in our term. So we see an entry for permanent regulations, and we wonder what gives this agency the right to make a regulation about this. And we see here it actually announces the regulatory authority. Comes from Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 146, Section 182. When you search for this section, you may try your luck by citing it as MGL, but also, since we know this is a Lexis product, we can use the Annotated Laws of Massachusetts, which is the citation that Lexis prefers because it's their proprietary annotated code. And we see this is where the authority comes from. The Bureau shall adopt regulations, including the classification of pipe fitters. So we found our regulation, we found where it appears in the state register, and where the authority comes from. So let's find the same thing on Westlaw. From Westlaw's page, you can see that of the content types, we have one entry called Regulations, and this is where we find all of that regulatory material. Notice you've got the Code of Federal Regulations, and you've got the Massachusetts Code of Regulations. Now, again, there's no index, just like in Lexis, so we are stuck navigating either through a bunch of titles or typing what we're looking for into the search bar. So we can see that there's an entry that pops up that is spot on, but we'll go ahead and search and see all the results. The search will lead us to that same one that we were looking at before. Now the next process, though, is a little bit different than getting to the entry for the Massachusetts Register. We see that there is a reference at the bottom to the Massachusetts Register, but there was no searching for it. How do you do it? You go to the History tab, and you can see Regulatory History. All of the results that come up here are to the Massachusetts Register. So if we want to find where this bureau gets the authority to issue pipe fitting licensure regulations. We can look into the entry in the Massachusetts Register, and we can go down right where we did in Lexis, and we see the same regulatory authority comes from Chapter 146, Section 82. So we'll just paste that into the search bar. And voila, we're back to our same statute. The Bureau shall adopt these regulations for pipe fitting licenses. And notice that we see down here a bit of legislative history. You can see where the statute was added and every time it's been amended. And these citations, since you know now what these statutory citations look like, these are to Acts and Resolves of Massachusetts. And you can see each one. Some of them you can even click on hyperlinks to. Others you have to find them in other ways. Now, how do we cite these things? How do we identify a citation as a regulation or as a statute if we see it in the wild and want to know what it is? The answer is we use the Blue Book. Any references to statutes, you will look in Rule 12, and this could be Rule 12 in the blue pages or Rule 12 in the white pages. The format is the same. The typeface may differ a little bit. So in Rule 12, you will see not only throughout this the way you would reference a United States Code section, there are also references to how to cite session laws, how they may appear as a public law citation, how they appear in statutes at large, and there are examples in this of state codes as well. If we don't quite know the format of a state code citation, we look it up in Table 1, T1, which starts on page 227. This lists all of the federal citations and the state citation formats too. And each one of these, if you're ever wondering, what is the citation I see, have a look in Table 1, and it can help you unravel the citations. The same goes for administrative materials, for regulations, for things in registers. You will find all of the formats in Rule 14, whether in the white pages or in the blue pages. A lot of the time, you will have to piece them together from Rule 14 and from what you see in Table 1. Why? Because the Blue Book doesn't give specific examples of every single type of citation in every way you would cite to it. So, you Frankenstein your citation together, and you have a very well put together citation that your reader will appreciate and be able to find the resource that it's looking for. And the same thing goes for you. When you look at a citation that looks confusing, you can unravel it by going in to the various rules that might apply. If you suspect it's a statute, look in Rule 12. If you suspect it's a regulation, look in Rule 14. Combine that with what you see in Table 1, and you will do just fine. So let me wrap up by saying that we in the Law Library are always here to help you out. If you ever have any questions about this material, come on over. You can call us, you can stop by, you can email, you can chat on our website. Please come on by. We are happy to help you, and I hope this has been informative and pleasant. Thank you.